There's a saying that goes, "The enemy of my friend is also my enemy." But is that really true? Is it always a good idea to take on our friends' enemies? Are there times when we shouldn't? And how do we know when to stand by our friends and when to step back? In this video, we're going to talk about a story from the Bible that's not often discussed, but it might make you think about what it really means to have an enemy. It's about a conversation between King David and his son Solomon, who was about to become king. We'll see why David gave Solomon some surprising instructions and what we can learn from them. David's last words to Solomon. Our story begins in 1 Kings 2, verses 8 to 9. King David was very old and knew he was going to die soon. He called his son Solomon, who would be the next king, and gave him some final instructions. One of these instructions was about a man named Shimei. David reminded Solomon how Shimei had cursed him when David was running away from his son Absalom during a time of war. Shimei threw stones at David and shouted mean things. Even though David had promised not to punish Shimei back then, he now told Solomon, "You are wise. You'll know what to do with him, but do not let him go unpunished." In other words, David was telling Solomon to find a way to deal with Shimei. But why did David act in such a way? And is it justifiable? To answer this question, it is imperative to find out who Shimei is. Who was Shimei, and why was he a problem? Shimei was from the tribe of Benjamin, the same tribe as King Saul, who ruled Israel before David. When David was in trouble, fleeing from his son Absalom, Shimei came out and cursed him, threw stones, and shouted insults. He called David a man of blood, blaming him for all the bad things that happened to Saul's family. Now, it wasn't David who killed Saul. Even though he had the opportunity to do that twice, he didn't seize it because he believed that he wasn't to touch God's anointed. Saul was actually the one who stopped at nothing to kill David, but didn't succeed because God didn't allow it since David was also God's anointed. Shimei's actions were not just mean. They were dangerous because they made David look weak. Shimei reminded everyone that some people were still loyal to Saul's family, and this could cause more problems for David as king. David didn't punish Shimei immediately because he didn't want more fighting when his rule was already at risk. But on his deathbed, David remembered Shimei and told Solomon to deal with him because he thought Shimei could still be a threat, and he wanted to make sure that his son had a peaceful reign. These are just speculations that make a lot of sense and are highly likely to reflect David's thoughts if you examine them closely. What did Solomon do? After David died, Solomon became king. Solomon didn't kill Shimei right away. I mean, why should he when Shimei had done nothing wrong? But Solomon, being wise, sought another way to fulfill his father's instructions. He needed to find a way to end Shimei's life. He put Shimei under house arrest, meaning he could not leave his house in Jerusalem. Solomon told him, "Build a house in Jerusalem and stay there. If you ever leave the city and cross the Kidron Valley, you will die." Shimei agreed and promised to stay in Jerusalem. Keeping him in that position would limit Shimei's activities if they were evil. But 3 years later, 2 of Shimei's servants ran away to the city of Gath. Shimei broke his promise and left Jerusalem to find them. When Solomon heard this, he called for Shimei and said, "Didn't I make you swear to stay in Jerusalem and never leave? And didn't you promise to obey? Why did you break your promise?" Solomon reminded Shimei of all the wrong things he had done to David and decided to carry out his father's wish. Solomon ordered Shimei to be executed, and he was put to death. By doing this, Solomon showed that he was a strong and wise king who could protect his kingdom from any threats. Why did David tell Solomon to do this? Some people, especially Christian folks who know this passage, think that because David told Solomon to kill Shimei, we should always take on the enemies of our friends or family. They argue that just as David left Solomon with the task of dealing with Shimei, we should carry on the grudges and conflicts of those close to us. But to understand why David made this request, we need to consider a few important points. Shimei was an intentional threat to David's throne. Shimei wasn't just a regular enemy. He was a real threat to David's rule as king. Being from Saul's family, Shimei represented the people who still wanted Saul's family to be in charge. By cursing David, Shimei was trying to weaken David's authority and possibly encourage others to rebel. David saw Shimei as more than just a personal enemy. He was a danger to the kingdom. This took place during a time of war. David gave his advice to Solomon during a time when Israel was experiencing many wars and conflicts. When a kingdom is at war, leaders often have to make hard decisions to keep their people safe. David's instruction to Solomon was about making sure the kingdom stayed secure and strong. It was in the Old Testament context. This story took place in Old Testament times when things were very different from today. Back then, kings had to act quickly to stop any threats to their rule. Sometimes, they had to do things that seemed harsh to us now, but it was what they thought was necessary to keep peace and order. You wouldn't want to kill anyone now, no matter how much of an enemy they are to you, would you? Moreover, we are talking about enemies on a grand political scale here, not minor threats like the ones we face today. We must also remind ourselves that David wasn't just a king. He was a man with political and combat intelligence. He understood the art of war quite well and knew what it took to maintain political power. Enemies in those days weren't something to be trifled with. They could be very dangerous if they weren't dealt with as soon as possible. So, keeping this in mind, what David did is justifiable, because if such drastic measures hadn't been taken, it could have led to a bad experience for his son Solomon. But we should also take a look at Solomon's actions as well. He didn't just go out and kill Shimei because his father told him to. Rather, he used wisdom to handle the issue. It wouldn't have looked good on him, nor would it have been right to kill someone without cause. But this is not to say that killing someone for leaving a town is justifiable. However, Shimei ensnared himself with the word of his mouth by accepting Solomon's terms, which made it legitimate. A possibility is that Shimei might have thought within himself that nothing could make him leave the city. Perhaps he just planned to die there. But then, after 3 years, Shimei's servants ran away. It wasn't recorded why they ran away. It could be that their master was a harsh man, and they ran to find freedom from his oppression, or they somehow heard about his house arrest and the oath he made with Solomon and tried to make him break it, or both, or none of these reasons. The bottom line is that he left and was killed. Now, having known all these facts, the question remains: do we inherit our friends, loved ones, fathers, or anyone's enemies, for that matter? Perhaps we begin by asking ourselves the following questions. Who is an enemy? An enemy is one who hates another and wishes him injury or attempts to harm him to gratify his own malice or ill will. We should think carefully about what it means to call someone an enemy. Many of the people we think of as enemies might just be people we've had disagreements with, who we don't see eye to eye with, or who we've had misunderstandings with. Often, these problems can be solved by talking and understanding each other. Before deciding to make someone else your enemy, consider if they really are an enemy or if it's just a conflict that can be resolved. Secondly, ask yourself, what side am I on? Before deciding to make someone else's enemy your own, ask yourself, do I really know the whole story? Perhaps the person with whom you are supporting or joining an alliance is the real person you should be cautious about. Perhaps he is the real enemy and not the other person. Always try to learn the full story of things. Thirdly, ask yourself, is this what God requires of me? We must remember that the days of King David and Solomon were days of war and conquest, and things were done differently compared to the New Testament. In the story of David and Solomon dealing with Shimei, we need to remember that things were very different in Old Testament times. Back then, problems like loyalty and threats to the king were dealt with very harshly. But in the New Testament, we learn a different way to handle conflicts and enemies. It teaches us to focus on love, forgiveness, and making peace with others. God expects us to love our enemies and do good to those who hate us. He asks us to try our best to live in peace with everyone. We should be peacemakers, not people who create more conflict. Instead of siding with your friend and inheriting an enemy one you know is innocent, it is wise to talk to your friend and let him find reason. Serve as a middleman to reconcile your friend with the one he fell out with. In addition, we must be careful about the inheritance of enemies, because you don't know if those you are coming up against are supposed to be among your greatest allies in the future. Many times, people contend with those who were ordained to be helpers of their destiny. So, should we inherit the enemies of our friends and loved ones? The answer is not always clear. King David had reasons for telling Solomon to deal with Shimei, But Solomon chose to handle the situation with wisdom, not just anger or revenge. We need to remember that not everyone we think of as an enemy truly is. Sometimes misunderstandings can be resolved by talking and understanding each other. Before deciding to make someone else's enemy your own, ask yourself if you really know the full story and if it's what God wants you to do. The Bible teaches us to love our enemies, forgive, and seek peace whenever possible. So, instead of making new enemies, let's focus on being peacemakers and building bridges, just like Jesus taught us. After all, you never know. The person you see as an enemy today could be an important friend tomorrow.